Hey, I'm back again. I'm sitting outside today because my husband's trying to work inside, but it's a little cold, a little chilly out here. So I've got my blankie, and I've got my coffee. So hopefully it won't be too bad, and hopefully there's not like too many birds or squirrels or cars being too loud. But so I just wanted to make this video now on this concept of heavens and earth, or the new heavens and earth. Just to recap kind of what we've been talking about. My whole story started, I'm going to try to make this really brief, but reading my Bible, getting to Matthew 24, reading all the signs that I thought applied to the end of the world, and then getting to verse 34, and it said, all these things will happen in this generation, the generation Jesus was speaking to 2,000 years ago. And I didn't know what to make of that. I did years of just like on this quest to figure it out, and didn't like the answers I was being given, but I did finally find some answers that, in my opinion, didn't try to twist the words of Jesus or to make a square peg fit in a round hole. And that led me to believe that Jesus wasn't a false prophet. He did keep his promises. He did everything that he said he would do when he did it in the lifetime of his disciples. But that leads to a whole sort of re-examination of sort of everything I believed about the future. And one of those concepts is this idea of the new heaven and earth. So that's what we're going to talk about today. But I want to take you back to Matthew 24, just because we're going to need that context. And I want to remind you that Matthew chapter 23 and Matthew 24, the context is completely temple related. I mean, it's just woven in there from beginning to end. And remember, Jesus is speaking to the Pharisees, and he's pronouncing all these woes on them, and then he says, behold, your house is left to you desolate. Their house was their temple. And he said, there's not going to be one stone left upon another. And then his disciples said to him, but look, Jesus, look at this temple, look how beautiful it is. And he explained to them that it was going to be destroyed. And they said, what will be the signs of your coming in the end of the age? Because they linked this destruction of the temple with the end of the age, and they saw those things as his coming in judgment on the temple, on the age of the old covenant. And so I want to demonstrate to you that not only is this idea of temple just completely throughout Matthew 23 and Matthew 24, it's also in this whole idea of the heaven and earth. And if you haven't watched my video yet on Matthew 24, please do that, because I know you're going to be saying to me, like, there's no way that Jesus fulfilled all those things in their generation, and none of those signs were fulfilled. And I just want to remind you that in my video, Glenn Beck and C.S. Lewis versus Jesus, I demonstrate how every single one of those signs was fulfilled, including the signs of preaching the gospel to the world, which came as a shock to me when I found it out, but I give you 4 or 5 scripture references from the New Testament proving that had happened. The false prophets, the famines, these things were mentioned as already having occurred in the New Testament. The abomination of desolation, we talked about that. We talked about the whole idea of the end of the age, and then how Jesus said, if people say it's near, don't believe them until you see all the signs. He said, all of these things will take place, and then you will know that I am near and at the door. So he's near and at the door when all the signs have taken place. And then we looked at James chapter 5, when James said, he is near and at the door. So you don't need to argue with me if you think that all those signs weren't fulfilled in the first century. You're going to have to argue with James because clearly James had seen the signs, or else he was a false prophet because he was saying Jesus was near and at the door. Okay, are you hanging with me there? So let's dig in a little more to this concept of the new heaven and new earth. And I think what everybody, immediately wants to jump to is Revelation, right? The new heaven and new earth of Revelation. So let's open our Bibles to to Revelation 21, and we're just going to read a little bit of that. Okay, I'm just going to start at the beginning of chapter 21. Then I saw a new heaven and a new earth, for the first heaven and the first earth had passed away, and the sea was no more. And I saw the holy city, the new Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven from God, prepared as a bride adorned for her husband. And I heard a loud voice from the throne saying, "Behold, the dwelling place of God is with man. He will dwell with them, and they will be his people, and God himself will be with them as their God." That's a really beautiful passage. I think that's probably one of my favorites, but I have to kind of tell you a funny story about this. It might be a little off topic, but really it isn't. I love the ocean, and I love, my favorite thing to do in the world is snorkel. I used to want to be a marine biologist. I actually went out to California when I was in high school for a summer and did marine biology classes, and I was going to be a dolphin trainer or something. But so when I read verse 1 and it says the sea was no more, I remember that really bothering me and thinking, why can't there still be an ocean in the new heavens and earth? And God created all these beautiful creatures in the ocean. I'm a big fan of orca. No more orca. It's really sad for me. I know that sounds kind of trivial, but I don't know. If you find beauty in the ocean, if you like to watch a good sunset from the beach, maybe you understand that this feels like a disappointment. But what if we've misunderstood what's being talked about here? What if this idea of heaven and earth, the old heaven and earth, the new heaven and earth, is not what we've been led to believe, and it's deeper than this surface level idea that we have of it. So I want to look at, this is going to seem unrelated, but I want to look at Matthew 5:18. Let me see if I can find it. I thought I had it marked, but I guess I didn't, so I'm going to have to, give me a minute. I should have had this ready. Okay. Jesus said, "For truly I say to you, until heaven and earth pass away, not an iota, not a dot will pass from the law until all is accomplished." So I don't know about you, but I also struggled with this verse, because it says right here, until heaven and earth pass away, not an iota, not a dot will pass from the law. And it really made me question, should I be keeping these old covenant laws? Should I be observing the Sabbath? Do I need to be keeping these feasts and making sure I don't mix different types of cloth or fabric in my clothing? This verse really disturbed me, and I found out I'm not the only person who struggled with this verse. People have been struggling with this verse for centuries. It's not like there's a good answer for this verse with just a literal rendering of heaven and earth. So what if in Matthew 24, what if in Revelation 21 and in Matthew chapter 5, when we read heaven and earth, what if there's more to it, more than meets the eye? What if there's something else there? So I found this article when I was kind of on this journey, and this article is titled, "When Heaven and Earth Passed Away, Everything Changed." And I think it's by this place called Reenacting the Way. I don't know if you can see that. I printed it out because it was so helpful to me. And I'm not going to read all of it to you, but it's so fascinating, okay? And it's describing the Jewish idea of heaven and earth. It's a lot different than what we think of it. And they viewed their whole temple and their whole Old Covenant system as heaven and earth. They literally called it heaven and earth. And here he's going to explain a little of why that came to be to us. So, let's see. Why don't Christians obey every letter of the law if Jesus said it applies until heaven and earth pass away? Great question. It's an important question, and very few Christians have taken time to address it. Okay, let's move on. Okay. Jews did not always mean the physical universe when they spoke of heaven and earth together. In Jewish literature, the temple was a portal connecting heaven and earth. They called it the navel of the earth, or actually the belly button of the earth, and the, quote, gateway to heaven. That's found in Jubilees in the book of Enoch. Just like the Mesopotamian tower in Genesis 11, he's talking about the Tower of Babel, the temple connected God's realm to where humans lived. Actually, it's interesting that he mentions the Tower of Babel because I found an article where they were unearthing this like ancient Sumerian text, and it was describing the Tower of Babel, and it referred to the Tower of Babel as heaven and earth. They called the Tower of Babel heaven and earth. I mean, it's so interesting. To reflect this belief, the Jerusalem temple had been built to look like a microcosm of the universe. We typically overlook how literally true the temple hymn preserved in Psalm 78:69 is. He built his sanctuary like the high heavens, like the earth, which he has founded forever. So right there in Psalm 78, it's saying the temple, the sanctuary, was built like the heavens and the earth. Okay? The actual holy place and most holy place inside the temple building were constructed like earth and heaven. The courts outside represented the sea. And then he says, I'm not making this stuff up, in case you're having trouble. Here's a little picture of it, which I think is kind of helpful. But here we have the Holy of Holies, the holy place, and then outside the sea. Okay? According to Josephus, the two parts of the tabernacle were approachable and open to all, but one was not. He explains that in so doing, Moses signifies the earth and the sea, since these two are accessible to all, but the third portion he reserved for God alone, because heaven is inaccessible to men. That's from Josephus. The veil, this is really cool. The veil between the accessible and inaccessible parts of the temple was designed to represent the entire material world during Jesus' day. Josephus and Philo agree that the veil was comprised of four materials representing the four elements: earth, water, air, and fire. Heaven was beyond this material world. It was behind the curtain. Isn't that cool? Heaven was beyond the material world, behind the veil. Outside the temple's microcosm of heaven and earth, the courts looked like the sea. The court surrounds the temple just as the sea surrounds the world. In Talmudic tradition, rabbis described how the inner walls of the temple looked like waves of the sea. From heaven and earth inside the temple, you looked out at the sea surrounding the world. The accessible section of the temple and the surrounding courts embodied both the landmass and sea believed to comprise the earth. The most holy place was heaven, where God resided. And then he gives more examples of heaven and earth in the Old Testament, like in Isaiah 65. And he talks about, for behold, I create a new heavens and a new earth, and the former things will not be remembered or come to mind. But be glad and rejoice forever in what I create. For behold, I create Jerusalem for rejoicing, and her people for gladness. And here he says Isaiah is predicting the eventual reconstruction of Jerusalem and its temple after its destruction at the hands of invaders. And so then he goes on to talk about, if we're going to look at Matthew chapter 5, now it's going to make sense, because when Jesus says, until heaven and earth pass away, nothing will pass from the law. Well, that makes sense now, because he's not talking about the literal physical heaven and earth. He's talking about the temple. It was their idiom for the temple. He reminds us that in Hebrews chapter 9, we've talked about this. It says the temple was the symbol for the present age, the old covenant. Okay? So, isn't that really cool? To think about the fact that they actually constructed the temple to look like and to represent heaven and earth. And now it makes a lot of sense when Jesus says in Matthew 24, all these things will take place in this generation. Heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will never pass away. Let's even just think about that for a second. Heaven and earth, the temple will pass away. The old covenant will pass away. My words will never pass away. I mean, his words are these words of life. They're the new covenant, okay? I'm going to argue, I'm going to suggest that the new heavens and new earth is the new covenant, okay? I know that's going to feel a little strange, but I'm going to give you some more things to think about, and I want you to kind of, before you spit it out of your mouth, I want you to kind of hear me out, okay? I want you to also, let's go back to Matthew 24 again, because that's where this whole thing started, and think about the whole context of it, right? It's the context of the destruction of the temple. That's what Jesus had said, your house is left to you desolate. But even the signs that he gives in Matthew 24, like the sun being darkened, the moon not giving its light, the stars falling from heaven, think about that. If that happened, it's describing the destruction of heaven and earth, right? If the stars fall, if the sun doesn't give its light, I mean, that is the destruction of heaven. And, if stars fall to earth, or if there's no more sun, this is the destruction of earth, right? So these signs that he's giving, the language he's using, are describing the destruction of heaven and earth, right? So it's just really consistent the whole way through. And keep in mind that the signs in the sun and moon and stars, these signs in the heaven, we talked about this in the video, Glenn Beck and C.S. Lewis versus Jesus, how those also clearly were, in the Old Testament, referred to, or were referring to this destruction of kingdoms, or they represented people or rulers. And even Joseph, when he had his dream, and he told his father about his dream, and he said, I saw the sun and the moon and 11 stars bowing down to me. His father said, do you think I and your mother and your brothers will bow down to you? He understood that language. This was their common Hebraic way of speaking, okay? Okay. Now, I want to look at Isaiah 51, 6 through 8. If you have your Bibles, you can turn with me. But now that we've kind of established this concept of heaven and earth might not really be, and isn't usually, talking about the physical creation, it's talking about the temple system. Isaiah 51, we'll start at verse 6. He says, lift up your eyes to the heavens and look at the earth beneath, for the heavens vanish like smoke. The earth will wear out like a garment, and they who dwell in it will die in like manner. So we have the heavens and the earth. Okay, he's not talking about, the sky. He's talking about the temple. And he says, it's going to vanish like smoke. It's going to wear out like a garment. Okay? And we know that's what he's talking about, because if you read the context of this passage in Isaiah 51, he's talking about Abraham, your father, Sarah, who bore you, Zion, Israel, my nation. He's talking about the law in verse 4, right? He says, my nation, the law will go out from me. Okay, this is all talking about Israel and her covenant relationship with God and her heaven and earth, this temple that represented God dwelling with man. Okay, but he's talking about how it's going to vanish away, and it's going to wear out like a garment. And then if we, on my Bible, it's just right across the page on the other side in verse 16, it says, I have put my words in your mouth and covered you in the shadow of my hand, establishing the heavens and laying a foundation of the earth, and saying to Zion, you are my people. So in verse 6, we have this destruction of heaven and earth. It's wearing out like a garment. It's vanishing like smoke. And then in verse 16, he's talking about establishing a heavens and an earth and calling it Zion and saying, you are my people. This is a comparison between the old covenant and the new covenant. This old covenant is going to vanish. It's wearing out like a garment. And this new covenant is called Zion, and it's where God's people are, and it's a new heavens and earth, okay? So, I mean, if you're like me, as soon as you hear that, wearing out like a garment, you think of the book of Hebrews. So let's just turn there. Let's see what Hebrews has to say about this. In Hebrews chapter 1, okay. Now, let me give you a little context to the book of Hebrews, actually, before we get going. Hold on one second. Okay. Now, you guys probably all know this already, and I'm just a little slow. But sometimes I think we, or at least I, can miss the forest for the trees, you know, like I miss the big picture. And it would have been so helpful for me if somebody would have explained this to me. But if we want to talk about the book of Hebrews and what it's all about, I mean, it's such, people think the book of Hebrews is so hard and it's like just really theological, but actually it's so simple, because the book of Hebrews, its theme, it's this one theme running throughout, this overarching theme is the old covenant versus the new covenant. It's all about how the new covenant is superior to the old covenant, okay? It has a better priest. It has better sacrifices. It's a better temple. It's all the things that made the old covenant, the new covenant is better, okay? And so that really, I don't know, that just helped me to understand what the book of Hebrews is all about. So with that in mind, as we read Hebrews 1, let's start in verse 10. You, O Lord, laid the foundation of the earth in the beginning, and the heavens are the work of your hands. They will perish, but you remain. They will all wear out like a garment. Like a robe, you will roll them up. Like a garment, they will be changed. I used to think he was talking about the physical heavens and earth here, and I'm sure some people do. But remember, the book of Hebrews isn't about the physical heaven and earth, right? It just isn't. There's nobody that's going to tell you that that's what the book of Hebrews is about. It's about the old covenant and the new covenant, okay? And if we really want to prove that verse where he's talking about it's going to wear out like a garment, okay? Let's go ahead and look at Hebrews chapter 8, okay? He's starting in verse 8, he's quoting Jeremiah, and he says, I'm going to establish a new covenant with the house of Israel, not like the covenant that I made with their fathers when I took them out of Egypt, okay? And he says, I will be their God and they will be my people. In speaking of a new covenant, I've skipped down to verse 13 here. So he's speaking of a new covenant. He makes the first one obsolete, and what is becoming obsolete and growing old is ready to vanish away. So, you're going to have to hang with me for a second, because I've heard people say this before and I didn't get it right away, but I'm getting it now, okay? What is this thing that's becoming obsolete and growing old and ready to vanish away? If we read Hebrews chapter 8, he defines it for us. He tells us exactly what it is. It's not the earth. It's not the physical creation, okay? It's the old covenant, okay? Because he says, in speaking of a new covenant, he makes the first one obsolete. He made the old covenant obsolete. And what is becoming obsolete? So we're still talking about the old covenant. It's becoming, in their day, becoming obsolete. And growing old is ready to vanish away. Okay, are you hanging with me? Does that make sense to you? This old heaven and earth that Isaiah 51 prophesied was going to vanish and grow old and become like smoke. Okay, that was the old covenant. And Isaiah prophesied a new heaven and earth, okay, this new covenant. And then in Hebrews, he again uses that exact same language, saying this old heaven and earth is growing old and becoming obsolete. But he defines that in chapter 8 as the old covenant is growing old and becoming obsolete. This new covenant is appearing, okay? Old covenant about to vanish, new covenant being confirmed, okay? Now we're going to turn back again to Revelation 21. And this is just so cool. I hope you're going to love this because, I don't know, it really struck me when I read it. But let's just read Revelation 21 again and see if we can look at it in a different light, if it seems a little different to us now that we've really dug in and read all of that about the old covenant growing old and is like a garment that needs to be changed, okay? Then I saw a new heaven and a new earth, for the first heaven and the first earth had passed away, and the sea was no more. And I saw the holy city, the new Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven from God, prepared as a bride adorned for her husband. And I heard a loud voice from the throne saying, Behold, the dwelling place of God is with men. He will dwell with them, and they will be his people, and God himself will be with them as their God. I don't know, it really struck me the other day as I was thinking about this, about this thing that was growing old. It was this garment that was wearing out, that needed to be changed. And suddenly in Revelation, we have a picture of this bride. And she's coming down from heaven. And she's beautifully adorned for her husband. Right? I mean, isn't that... Do you catch the power of that? It's a beautiful comparison between the old covenant and the new covenant. You can almost imagine them. I mean, they called the temple the tent. And I think in the Old Testament, when they made the tabernacle, it was a tent. And they were to cover it with like goat skins, or manatee skins or something. And that was their covering. It was their covering. But it was growing old. It was starting to get holes in it. I'm not talking about physical holes that you could see with your physical eye. I'm talking about it was no longer able to provide even a semblance of salvation because it was corrupt. It was so corrupt. In Jesus' day, the high priesthood went to the highest bidder, okay? Jesus himself went into the temple and said, You've turned my Father's house into a den of robbers. It was growing old. And when we think of this covering, this garment that needed to be changed, I go all the way back to Genesis. Remember when Adam and Eve sinned and they put these like fig leaves on themselves, and God said, no, that's not going to do it. And he killed the animal and he made them a covering of skins. That was their covering. But now that covering is growing old. It needs to be replaced with something new. And that thing that replaced it is the new heavens, the new earth, the new temple, the new tabernacle, right? And it says, behold, the dwelling of God is with the people, and they will dwell with him, and he will dwell with them. That was the whole idea of temple for them, God with man. But remember, we have to really think about what this new temple, what this new covenant looked like, because it wasn't the same as the old. Let's look at Hebrews again. Let's look at Hebrews chapter 9. This is so good. There's just so much good stuff here. I read Hebrews in a whole new way. I hope that even if you don't agree with what I'm saying, I hope maybe you can find something here that helps you. But Hebrews 9:22. Indeed, under the law, almost everything is purified with blood, and without the shedding of blood, there is no forgiveness of sins. Thus it was necessary for the copies of the heavenly things to be purified with these rites. What's he saying here, these copies of the heavenly things? He's saying that the temple wasn't the heavenly temple. It was a copy of it. When Moses made the tabernacle in the wilderness, he prepared it according to the copy that God had given to him, the plan. It was a replica. It wasn't the real thing. The real thing was in heaven. But the heavenly things themselves, with better sacrifices than these, so he's saying we have to purify the heavenly ones with better sacrifices than these. For Christ has entered not into holy places made with hands, which are copies of the true things, but into heaven itself, now to appear in the presence of God on our behalf. Isn't that so cool? I mean, Christ purified the heavenly temple with the sacrifice of his own blood. It's not a physical temple, okay? It's not a physical heavens and earth. This is a beautiful depiction of the real deal, which is spiritual. Let's look at verses 25 to 28. Nor was it to offer himself repeatedly as the high priest enters the holy places every year with blood not his own, for then he would have had to suffer repeatedly since the foundation of the world. But as it is, he has appeared once for all, now at the end of the ages, to put away sin by the sacrifice of himself. Okay? Do you see what I'm saying? He's saying Christ is entering this heavenly temple, this new heavens and earth, the real one that's in heaven, the spiritual one. And when we think of that temple, it says, these things made with hands. That's in verse 23. Christ has entered not into holy places made with hands. Yet again, what does it mean, made with hands? He's not talking about the earth was made with hands. God didn't make this physical earth with hands. Does anyone remember how God created the world? He spoke it into existence, right? He spoke it. He didn't make it with hands. There was something that was made with hands, though, okay? And Hebrews chapter 9, verse 24. Let's look at that. Oh, that's the wrong reference. Hold on. Sorry. The update on the iPhone now gives you this like pause button, so it's kind of nice. I can just pause it and start again. I could pause it for that squirrel that's barking in the tree, but I don't think it would do any good. But what I meant to say was 2 Corinthians 5. It says, we have a building from God, a house not made with hands, right? He's comparing the earthly temple that was made with hands to the heavenly temple, okay? Let's look at Hebrews 9, verse 22. Oops, not 9, 12. Silly me. Here it is. 12:22. But you have come to Mount Zion, to the city of the living God, the heavenly Jerusalem, to innumerable angels in festal gathering, and to the assembly of the firstborn who are enrolled in heaven, and to God, the judge of all, and to the spirits of the righteous made perfect, and to Jesus, the mediator of a new covenant, to the sprinkled blood that speaks a better word than the blood of Abel. Look at that. We're at Mount Zion. It's the city of the living God, the heavenly Jerusalem, right? That's where these people had come to. And it's the assembly of the firstborn who are enrolled in heaven, and to the spirits of the righteous made perfect. It doesn't say to the bodies of the righteous made perfect, right? These are spirits. And this heavenly Jerusalem is a spiritual Jerusalem. Remember where it says, and you as living stones are being built up, right? We're not like, well, when I was younger, I was a cheerleader, and, you know, we'd have to like climb on top of each other and make these pyramids. It's kind of in my mind what I have, this idea in my mind, if we're going to take this literally and imagine ourselves as stones being stacked on one another. Like, I don't really want to be the bottom of that pyramid. It's going to get pretty heavy with all you guys stacked up on top of me. But this isn't about physical stones, right? We understand that. It reminds me of Daniel. I think it's Daniel chapter 2, right? Where Nebuchadnezzar has his dream, and there's like the head of gold, and then the arms and chest of silver, and then there's like the bronze thighs and waist, and then there's like the iron and the clay. And then what happens? A stone comes, and it's cut out from a mountain, right? That's funny because they've just come to Mount Zion, right? And the stone that is cut out, I mean, am I wrong to think maybe it's the cornerstone, right? This cornerstone, Jesus Christ, our Savior, has been cut out, and he shatters it all. And then what happens? It becomes a great mountain, and it fills the whole world. You know? That wasn't meant to be a literal depiction of what was happening. You know, it's funny, people keep saying like, well, you're not taking it literally. And I would agree. In the book of Daniel chapter 2, he's using a lot of symbolism there. You know, I don't think kingdoms are actually this statue with the gold head and all that. And I don't think Jesus is literally a stone. But when it comes to the heavenly Jerusalem, I thought about this the other day. Just because I believe it's spiritual, just because I believe that the new heavens and the new earth is a heaven and earth of spirit, does not mean that I don't think it's literal, right? I mean, a spirit is a real thing. And isn't it so shallow of us, honestly, to put so much emphasis on what we can see and touch, that we almost deny the spiritual reality? And as I was just thinking about that, I was kind of thinking all the way back to David. Remember when Samuel went to find the next king of Israel, and he knew it was going to be one of Jesse's sons, and all Jesse's sons are passing before him, and they all look so good. And every time he thinks, surely this is it. This is who God wants. And every time God said, no, it's not him. And Samuel, he was getting discouraged. And God said, man looks at the outward appearance, but the Lord looks at the heart. David was a king that had a heart for God. And it's the same way when we think about this new heavens and earth, and we want it to be physical. I feel like we're just putting this emphasis on the outward appearance, on the physical, and we're missing the heart, the spirit of it, okay? And when we really think about what was happening to the old covenant during this time, it was growing old. It was becoming, I think in the book of James it says, like, your garments are moth-eaten. You know, I don't think he was actually talking about their clothes. He was talking about people that were relying on the law, right? Their covering. The law was supposed to be this covering that covered their shame of their sin, and they had holes in it. It was just, the holes were growing day by day. But on the outside, every day the temple looked more beautiful. Herod, if you're familiar with Herod the Great, you know, he was a great builder, and he started renovations on the temple, and he just kept making it more elaborate and adding more gold and making it bigger and grander, and every day, you know, the construction on the temple lasted for decades, his remodel, and I think, you know, continued after his death, and if I'm remembering right, it lasted until 66 AD, the year that the Jews rebelled against Rome, the start of the Jewish-Roman War. That's when this remodel finished. So outwardly, it was growing more beautiful day by day, but inwardly, it was corrupt. God sees the heart. He saw the heart and the spirit of the temple system, and he saw that it was corrupt. And, you know, think about what he said to the Pharisees. He said, "You're blind guides." They had eyes. They could see physically, but he looked inside of them and he knew they were blind with their spirit. And he said, "You're whitewashed tombs." Think about that. That must have been pretty offensive. You know, they looked good on the outside, but inside they were full of bones and death. This was the old covenant system, okay? It was growing beautiful on the outside. On the inside, it was wasting away. But then we have this contrast, because in the New Testament, we see the apostles saying that they are on the outside wasting away, right? On the outside, they're being beaten. Oh, I've got a delivery. Pause. Oh, goodness. This is going to go down in history as the absolute worst video ever. I'm sorry, but, you know, I'm just not very good at this, and I really don't want to have to do this all over again, so we're just going to have to put up with the squirrels and the deliveries, because I just can't start it all over. And I don't have the technology to edit, you know, I'm not, oh boy, I'm just not that good with it, so it is what it is. But my point was, okay, where were we? We were talking about how the temple was looking more and more beautiful on the outside. On the inside, it was wasting away. And we have this contrast, okay, with the disciples and the apostles on the outwardly. Let's see, this is 2 Corinthians 4:16. Therefore, we do not lose heart, though outwardly we are wasting away, yet inwardly we are being renewed day by day. It's just so beautiful. Don't get me going. Okay. So I'm going to have to just end this before it gets really bad, but I did have a couple other things I wanted to read really quickly that I think just say it way better than I could. This is Charles Spurgeon, okay? Not crazy. I don't think everybody thinks he's crazy, but he confirms what I'm saying here. He says, "Did you ever regret the absence of the burnt offering or the red heifer, or any of the sacrifices and rites of the Jews? Did you ever pine for the Feast of Tabernacles or dedication? No, because though these were like the old heavens and earth to the Jewish believers, they have passed away, and we now live under new heavens and earth, as far as the dispensation of divine teaching is concerned. The substance is come, and the shadow is gone, and we do not remember it." It's beautiful. And then last, my family would die if they knew I was doing this. I'm going to read you a poem. So when my kids were little, I made them memorize like a lot of poetry. We were really big into poetry memorization, and you know, a lot of the Bible is like poetry. I think these things that we've been discussing, you know, this new heaven, this earth, this one thing growing old, this garment that needs to be changed, and then this bride coming down from heaven and she's dressed so beautifully. Like, this is poetry, okay? But this is a poem called Project by Mary Fabian Windiat. Now it is well that we should start planning a fortress in the heart, building with things which will endure longer than sorrow's signature. Take away stone, take away wood, faith is 10,000 times as good. Take away steel, take away lead, charity, hope will do instead. Thus, when the years pile up the pain, we can go seeking peace again, back of the walls heaven designed just for the hurts of humankind. This is the kind of temple we're living in now, okay? And I also wanted to talk about the nature of death, but it's just not going well, let's face it. And also, this video is too long, so that'll have to be for another day. But thanks for hanging in there.